Welcome to This Explainer. You know, when we think about UFOs, our brains almost instantly jump straight to sci-fi, right? We picture glowing flying saucers, late-night close encounters, and those shadowy, top-secret government labs. But what happens when the bizarre actually collides with the incredibly mundane reality of government bureaucracy? Today, we are exploring a really fascinating set of declassified documents from the Royal Australian Air Force, or RAAF. We're not looking for little green men today, nope. Instead, we're looking at how a massive military organization tries to process, categorize, and ultimately file away the unexplainable, using the absolute best weapon they have: paperwork. Right out of the gate, take a look at this. For most of these reports, the story inevitably ends up right here. This massive, aggressive file closed stamp, taking up almost the entire page of this authentic, once classified military record. That pretty much sets the tone for what we're looking at today. These documents reveal an Air Force that wasn't exactly sitting around awestruck by the cosmos. Actually, they were just totally overwhelmed by public inquiries. Their goal wasn't necessarily to unlock the secrets of the universe. It was just to close the file so they could get back to their day jobs. Section 1. The Australian UFO Syndrome. So how did we even get to that giant file close stamp? Well, we have to travel back to Australia in the late 1960s and early 70s. Space exploration was front-page news everywhere, and the public's interest in flying saucers was just exploding. Look at this internal military memo from June 1969. You can almost feel the exhaustion reading it. It literally says, the public is becoming more and more susceptible to the UFO syndrome. They saw the press and radio absolutely thriving on the topic, which trickled up to politicians asking non-stop questions. The military didn't see some grand scientific awakening, they saw an administrative nightmare. Section 2. Standardizing the investigations. So what does a highly structured military organization do when faced with a rampant public obsession? Well, they don't call in Mulder and Scully, for sure. They write a standard operating procedure. This official policy directive, called Support Command Air Staff Instruction No. 3/3, dictated exactly how local commanders across Australia had to handle incoming UFO reports. Because they were covering a massive geographical area, they pushed the responsibility down to local units. The logic was that local officers would know the local weather, natural phenomena, and flight paths way better. Let's break down exactly what that instruction required. It was a strict 4-step dance for every single sighting. Step 1. Send a routine signal to command headquarters with brief details. Step 2. Appoint an investigating officer. Step 3. Interview the observer using a specific pro forma questionnaire. And finally, Step 4. Liaise with civil authorities, like meteorologists or air traffic control, to figure out what the object actually was. Sounds pretty foolproof and grounded, right? Well, let's see how that actually played out in the real world. Section 3. Frustrations with blank forms. As it turns out, creating a rigorous protocol on paper is one thing, but relying on human beings to actually execute it is a whole different ballgame. The military's strict administrative net fell apart super fast, mostly thanks to plain old human error and, frankly, administrative laziness. In that same June 1969 memo, headquarters specifically lists the typical faults they were seeing on incoming UFO reports. Investigating officers were leaving the civil aircraft section completely blank. They weren't bothering to calculate planetary positions. Entire blocks of questions were just left totally unanswered. Now here is my absolute favorite detail from these files. The top brass actually had to scold officers about this. They pointed out that if investigators had just bothered to fill out the planet calculation section, they would have realized that the planet Venus was in the exact appropriate position in the sky during the sighting. And to make it even worse, it was at its greatest brilliancy. Basically, the military was out there actively chasing the second brightest natural object in the night sky, all because some officer didn't feel like doing a little bit of math. The sheer exasperation of the military leadership completely peaks in a follow-up directive. They sternly reminded everyone that questions must be completely answered in writing, plainly stating, a dash conveys no information at all. I mean, you can just picture some frustrated commander in Melbourne staring at a massive stack of UFO reports filled with nothing but blank spaces and little dashes. Section 4. Managing Media and Public. So while the Air Force is fighting this internal battle against blank forms, civilian UFO groups, and a totally frenzied media, we're actively bleeding into their daily operations. Take a look at this clipping from an Adelaide newspaper in October 1971. It claimed an RAAF UFO investigator was going to speak at a public symposium. Well, internal, highly restricted memos frantically circulated to completely deny this. The military flatly rejected that any officer would participate, noting that the newspaper got the rumors straight from the civilian UFO societies themselves. This civilian enthusiasm was getting so intense, it was actually impacting military personnel. Check this out. A restricted message from May 1972 notes that several airmen at a base in South Australia had actually joined rival flying saucer research societies. The memo humorously complains that these groups are competing with each other in similar fashion to tow truck operators trying to investigate sightings. One airman even took leave to go on an investigation safari 90 miles away. The military desperately needed a unified policy to rein all this in. Section 5, the official standard response. To manage the mounting pressure and the absolute mountain of paperwork, Air Force intelligence developed the ultimate bureaucratic weapon. In September 1971, they proposed a standardized pro forma reply, basically a form letter. Because citizens were rarely told the outcome of their reports, it was creating a lot of bad PR. So this form letter was the perfect fix: acknowledge the person, give them an official-sounding conclusion, and totally shut down the conversation. And to make sure the public wouldn't argue with them, the letter leaned heavily on massive, well-funded American studies. They explicitly cited the U.S. Air Force's Project Blue Book and the Condon Report. By quoting the Condon Report's conclusion that further extensive study of UFOs probably cannot be justified, the RAAF was basically giving citizens the polite brush-off. They were saying, look, the world's top scientists already looked into this, there's nothing to see here, so please stop calling us. The standard response also used the military's own internal data to back up their dismissals. Between January 1960 and May 1971, the RAF officially received 572 UFO reports. They assessed that a staggering 93% were entirely explainable by present scientific knowledge. 6% lacked sufficient information, which, let's be honest, was probably due to those dashes on the forms we talked about, and just 1% of all reports were officially attributed to unknown causes. And this wasn't just an Australian thing either. The form letter actually compared their 93% explainable rate directly with data from the UK Air Ministry, who reported a 90% explainable rate for their own sightings. Most of those were just weather balloons, meteors, or aircraft lights. So it showed a really consistent international trend. Whenever the military actually dug in and investigated, the vast majority of the extraordinary turned out to be completely ordinary. So that brings us to the final product, the general statement in relation to unidentified flying objects. This structured form letter basically closed the book on the public's reports with a super simple fill-in-the-blank system right at the top. It literally read, your report has been investigated and the object was, followed by a blank line. For the investigator to just scribble Venus or weather balloon, it was incredibly efficient, highly authoritative, and the best part for them, it required absolutely zero follow-up. Through strict instructions, non-stop complaints about blank forms, and ultimately a fill-in-the-blank dismissal letter, the military managed the bizarre by simply burying it in bureaucracy. But as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a thought based on their own data. They successfully explained away 93% of those sightings. But what about that final metric? Does a standardized 93% explainable rate satisfy you, that there's nothing out there? Or does that lingering 1% of true unknowns, the ones even the military couldn't just put a stamp on, still leave room for wonder? Something to think about. Thanks so much for learning with us today.